I think we're. Oh, meeting's now being recorded. Thank you. So welcome to room 3. Jess and I are going to have a conversation. We've got until I think 11:45 until we go back. So we're going to have a conversation for probably half of that time. Apologies if we overrun because we might get carried away with ourselves. But then we want to open it up for you to be able to ask us any questions. So please do that when we hand over to you. So Jess is going to give you a short intro into her work in Hastings. And like I say, then we'll ask ourselves each other a set of questions as we go through. So Jess, would you like to set the scene for Hastings?
Okay, thanks, Wendy. It's great to be here. I'm just going to share my screen and just give you a very brief kind of background context to what we're doing in Hastings. This is this tiny piece of Hastings where I've been focused pretty much for the past 15 years. The Hastings Pier is just to the top of that slide, just out of view there. My interest is in self-renovating neighbourhoods. This is a phrase I made up some time ago, and have spent the last decade really trying to work out what does it mean, and doing that in a very active way. And out of that process, working obviously with lots of other people, has emerged this idea of the Hastings Commons, which is both a set of buildings and a kind of practice, a kind of commoning approach. So this shows what we've taken into custodian ownership. All of these buildings will end up in the ownership of the Community Land Trust. 8,000 square metres of building, all very close together, as you can see. So very much fine grain neighbourhood. Um, when I say I'm talking about this ecosystem of organisations. Probably the two critical ones in there that help us move all this forward is White Rock Neighbourhood Ventures, which is a social enterprise developer, which is itself a joint venture, and Heart of Hastings Community Land Trust, the long-term freehold owner of all these properties. But I hope that in the conversation we can come back to this kind of idea around this ecosystem, because I think it's quite important in terms of how we've been able to scale rapidly. Just to give you an idea of the state of dereliction, Hannah and Wendy were talking about the millennium being really scary. Uh, this is not a competition, but this is a 7-storey building that's been empty for 35 years. Um, there are an awful lot of pigeons, and a great deal of water has flown through that building in that time. So this is a pretty derelict space right in the centre of Hastings. This just gives you an idea of the kind of quality that we want to bring to the renovations. But they are renovations, so this is about uh, what I'll come back to later, darning the fabric of the neighbourhood. It's not about destroying it and starting again. Um, but it's what goes in the buildings that really matters, and this slide shows the ones that are clustered around this alley, which itself is common ground. It's not owned or adopted by anybody. And what goes in them is mixed uses, but all about capped rents. So living rents, flats, and capped rent workspaces, to make sure there will always be some affordable places to live and work in Hastings, despite the very scary gentrification pressures that are underway there. This is our latest building and really exciting. It looks appalling. This is what it used to look like on the left, but in the 1980s the whole front fell off because Hastings at that time was so seriously disinvested that there was literally no maintenance, and so we ended up with this rather ugly frontage on that Dalton's building. We've taken that over and we're using the well-being to design the future uses of that space. Um, so to do this so far has taken 68 separate funding awards since 2014, totalling over £14 million, with a further 6.5 million allocated in principle currently awaiting decisions. So that will take us into about 75 different funding sources. That's an awful lot of relationship management, an awful lot of bidding, an awful lot of monitoring. Um, so to get away from that, to try and bring some humour back to it all, to bring the buildings to life, we've turned them into characters. Because, as I said at the beginning, the Commons isn't just about the buildings. The buildings are critically important. They're the common ground resources, but actually it's about commoning practice, it's about self-renovating, and therefore it's kind of about solidarity. So I'll leave it there, Wendy. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks for that, Jess. So we had a conversation to plan this, and what we started to notice was that we had some similarities in our approaches, but we also had some differences. So our first kind of question, or our first way of demonstrating those differences and similarities, was that we just wanted to talk about our approaches to scaling. So for Nudge, we've seen rapid growth and agile growth since we started in November 2017. We've just, like I said on the bigger call before, we've just bought our 4th building. And that it isn't a competition, but we've got 4,813 square meters, so less than Jess, but we just wanted to kind of give you that top trump key facts, if you like, between the two organisations. But similar to Hastings, we're really interested in unlocking the potential in the buildings for our community, so as they benefit from that and have lasting change that they can see over the years, because the properties then get locked in. We haven't quite got 75 different funding relationships to manage, but we have got a number of different funders, and we've had brilliant relationships with those, particularly with Rank, who were our early supporter, and recently with Power to Change, who are really enabling us to be able to unlock those buildings by creating a fund for us that we use then to be able to put deposits down, or we can use it for our core costs. So I just wanted to also say that this year in January, we were approached by our local reporter, business reporter at the Herald newspaper, who wanted to do an article on Nudge. And we were talking about how we go about using a very deliberate approach of step by step and piece by piece. That we don't do kind of predict and control. We don't write up a huge plan on the building, because we want to be able to be iterative. We want to hear from people, and we would want to correct the course or change the course depending on what our community's aspirations are. But when he published the article, I was really saddened to read that he described our approach as being piecemeal, and it was piecemeal redevelopment. Which felt like it was very kind of patronising, and it didn't really pick up the nuance of what we were trying to get across. And then Hannah and I have been recently talking to Erica Rushton and her team from Kindred in Liverpool, and they really wanted to understand why Hannah and I weren't reclaiming that word, that actually we should reclaim that word and turn it round into being something very positive for ourselves, because it is through that step by step and piece by piece that we get to understand what our community wants us to respond to, and then what we're able to deliver. And so we want all the time to keep our plans loose enough for them to be able to imagine a place both within it as well as in its future. And like I said, we don't want to predict and control and have a rigid plan, because we really believe that would stifle our ability to be able to pivot, if you like, and to make sure that we're responding. So Jess, would you like to say what your approach is to scaling?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about piecemeal, because I thought that was so interesting when we were speaking about it before. That so piecemeal, a bit at a time, is no bad thing, but piecemeal is used in that patronising way to say that you don't have strategy, that you don't understand properly the bigger picture. But I think it's a great idea to reclaim the word, and this is what created the breakthrough back in Granby in Toxteth in Liverpool. that for decades Liverpool City Council had been pushing this strategy of comprehensive renewal, of wholesale renewal. In other words, destroy everything that's there and build something new. Um, and they were faced by very defensive campaigning, local people saying no, protecting their streets, lying down in front of bulldozers, literally that defensive approach. But then around about 2006, local people there started to take a different approach and started to do gardening in the street and painting up the tinned up houses and holding table sales, and that kind of slow process of becoming positive and taking that kind of neighbourhood housework approach. And then they formed a community land trust, and they really pushed that idea of piecemeal. Don't destroy, don't do comprehensive renewal. Let's do a bit at a time. We'll do a bit, someone else do a bit, let's get started. In 2014, they got the first 10 houses from the City Council. 2 years later, they won the Turner Prize, and Granby has been transformed, but is still completely recognisable. And I think that's what's so powerful about piecemeal, is that you're darning the fabric of your inherited neighbourhood. We have our neighbourhoods. We don't want to destroy our neighbourhoods and build some new city on them. We want to darn the fabric of them, and that's why I think piecemeal is perfect, and it certainly describes what we do too. But it doesn't have to be kind of non-strategic or not thought through. And that's, we spoke yesterday about Frederick Laloux's book, which he talks about reinventing organisations. He's got this fantastic metaphor about when you ride a bike, you don't write a business plan first. You get on the bike, you set off. You steer, you adjust to the environment, whether it's flat or hilly, what the weather's like, how rough the road is, how much traffic there is. And that's how we work. We get on with it. We kind of get on the bike and steer and adjust, like you said, correct the course as you go along. And that is, I think, a very powerful approach, way of thinking about what we're doing. And instead of the master plans and the big kind of processes of planning, which can be good, but at the end of the day, they distract you away from getting on the bike, starting the process, and moving forwards with your local community.
Absolutely. And equally, when we spoke yesterday, I was talking to Jess about, I went along to a master planning session for Mill Bay, which is literally just on the edge of, well, it'd be about 500 yards away from Union Street. And I went when I was pregnant, and my son now is 17, and that is not built out in the way that are being presented to the community. And for us, it's incredibly important. We're thinking about, should we do some master planning on the street? And when we've looked at the process of master planning, we already know a lot of detail. We probably know more than the experts that might come in and write the master plan with us after we do some consultation. But we're also playing with a name that Erica Rushton was saying, should it be called a mistress plan? And we really like that as a women-led organisation, and sort of playing around with that sort of gender of the master planning. But we're also really keen, and that's why we operate the way that we do, is that we don't want to overpromise. That's one of our core values, that Nudge would never overpromise to our community. And when we look at those master plans, they can often be really head-turning and really amazing, and you think, gosh, that would be really great to have in our community. But there isn't any sort of sense about the deliverability of those master plans. Or, well, the mistress plan, if we do the mistress plan, will absolutely be deliverable. And we would want to talk more about the kind of trauma as well, that the street encounters and people encounter on the street, and how those buildings might be informed by that trauma, and therefore how they will be really welcoming for people to come in. So we want to really disrupt, not for disruption's sake, but actually just start saying, we want to do this our way, on our terms, and our community are experts. Our community know a lot of things that they would want and that they would dream about for their future. So why not absolutely try and turn things a little bit on their head? And from you talking about Frederick Laloux yesterday, I did skim read kind of half of that book last night, and I do really love it. Um, so we also talked yesterday about how important funding was, particularly at the early stages, Jess, of getting a project going. And I can't imagine trying to manage 75 relationships and all of the monitoring that you would need to do. So kind of well done. That's
They're
amazing.
not all at once, thankfully. They don't,
No,
well, some of them are closed,
yeah,
completely done.
absolutely. But do you want to talk as well a little bit about how important it is at early stages of getting projects going? How, you know, funding has been really, really crucial for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, a lot of the early funding for developing the Community Land Trust, for example, was actually feasibility funding of various kinds to investigate specific buildings. Um, and it doesn't matter that those specific feasibility studies and plans we developed then didn't happen like that. What mattered is that we had the capacity, we had some support and some capacity to move forward. And so it's not, they were certainly not failures even though they didn't happen. So for example, back in 2013 we got £10,000 to investigate buying the Observer building. We didn't buy it in 2013. We ended up buying a different building next door, Rock House, which we didn't have a feasibility study for, but we bought it anyway. And then 6 years later we end up in ownership of the Observer building. So you could say, did that £10,000 help us buy the Observer building? Kind of, but it was a very, very long time ago. And so all of that pipeline of money is really crucial. But sometimes I wish we could just be honest and not say this is for you to commission a consultant to write a feasibility study, but rather, or worst even, this is for you to rush to procure an architect to develop the whole plans so that you can get planning permission, because only then will some funders recognise it as a capital project. A lot of funders who don't actually have any experience of doing buildings themselves think that a capital project begins either with the building contract or begins with the planning permission, and that's, neither of those is true. The capital project begins way, way, way before that. And sometimes it's really important to go slowly in those early stages, not to rush to procure your architect to get your planning permission and so on. So you actually need more flexible and more funding in that early stage, not just because we need it in order to get to the late stage, but because the early stage itself is really important. And it's during that time that you're perhaps occupying the building in a meanwhile sense and getting used to it and starting to test things in it and starting to feel what it might be like with the people who might use it with you. All of that work is so important and should be given much longer, because you're getting loads of benefits in the meanwhile and you're taking the time to get it right. You did something similar,
Completely.
didn't you?
Yeah, completely agree. We like to say that we want to play with our buildings before we want to put the plan together. So at the moment with the Millennium, we're trying to invite as many meanwhile uses in, particularly around the venue space. So as we really understand how it operates. So we've got an after party for when the hatchling comes in August. That'll happen in the building. We've got a drag fashion show and party that's going to happen in September. And we're hoping that we'll have some theatre performances as well. And we've always had that in each of our buildings. The Theatre Royal have been brilliant in the Clipper and in the Plot. And simply by having to do the risk assessment on a sort of a derelict empty building, it moves you on. Simply by having to then put some things in place to manage and mitigate those risks, it moves you on in a way that a feasibility study wouldn't be doing. So although they're really important to kind of understand and to get to grips with the building, it's the action in them that we really think tells us a lot about how the building will function, and then it helps you with the design later. And then also just to talk about when we got an access grant, and that was £10,000 for us to be able to plan our share offer. What most people, when they go, when we met other people that had access grants, they use that mostly on consultants to help them get their community share offer ready. And we did absolutely commission Dave Boyle. He was brilliant, from the share unit, to help us go through and get the quality mark, all those sorts of things. We paid to design our community share offer, but we also used some of that £10,000 very practically to pay for things like building control. So as we could open up the cafe downstairs, we could welcome in people at the time of when we ran our share offer, we opened the cafe downstairs. So that flexibility on funding, so as you can practically do things as well as plan and get yourself ready, is really, really vital. We spoke as well, Jess, about how we treat our buildings in terms of whether they stand alone or whether they cross-subsidise, and how we potentially get them to stack up. I've heard you on another call talking about how you use the equity in one building to get other things going. And I really liked the way that you talked about risk as well. And I hope I'm getting this right, that you spoke that you wanted to sweat as much equity out of those buildings as you possibly could, because otherwise you would think that you weren't doing enough for your community to really make the change that will be lasting and enable people to get future opportunities. And I love that you're doing that. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah. So my partner is always saying to me when I'm freaking out and worrying about things, he's always saying, "Can't you just pay off some debt for once? Pay off some debt, get at least one of these buildings to not have any loans on it." But every time my response is that if you've got a building with no debt on it, it's not working hard enough, because that equity is sitting there in community trust for the benefit of the community. So the equity itself, not just the space, the building and itself, but the equity held in the building, the value that you've added to it, should be squeezed to do something else with it. In our case, buy the building next door. So we bought Rock House, 9-storey office block, converted that slowly in this sort of organic phased development process, and then it goes from costing us 235,000 to buy to being worth 1.6 million. Well, what do you do with that? You just sit back and go, "Oh, that's good." Oh no, you take a mortgage on it, a £1.2 million mortgage on it, to buy the very, very difficult Observer building next door. Sorry, my dog has decided the postman has arrived.
That's okay. Everyone has the same, don't they? Luckily, I've trapped mine in another room somewhere. So when Jess and I talked yesterday, our approach to thinking about taking on debt and thinking, so we normally try to buy a building quickly because the market dictates when you need to go and get that building, rather than we haven't campaigned over buildings. We have a bit with the Millennium. We were trying that for 3.5 years, but we weren't necessarily public facing with a campaign around that. But we often will get a very low interest loan or a 0% interest loan to be able to establish ownership of a building. And then within a year, we would run a share offer. So as we flushed back that finance, so as then we genuinely have a number of people that alongside us will own that building. And how we assess what we would do from that initial raise, or how we would ever take on loans, was that we got advice from Dave Boyle really early on when we were thinking about our community share offer. And I love this. He said to us, so every time you get a loan or you do a share offer, are you going to tip that funding into the bath, or are you going to put it into an ice cube? So therefore you think about each building as an ice cube. And we really loved that. And I guess the way that Hannah and I slept at night for our first share offer, and that we would continue to do that, is that we will always look at each building as an ice cube. So we wouldn't ever take more finance on that would exceed the value of that building. So should something happen, we would be able to sell that asset, so as we didn't let our shareholders down, and they would have their money returned to them. And so we also then were just talking about how do we make sure that they stack up, if you like. So when we look at that share offer as well, we would look to be able to quite quickly have a tradable income that would fulfill the shareholder dividend as well as the repayment. So Our share offer for the Clipper was that you locked in your money for the first 3 years. So from October this year, we will be paying £20,000 or offering to pay £20,000 back on a first come, first serve to our shareholders. And we have paid 3.6% every year on the money that we raised. So we make sure, so we've got 2 flats above and we rent out the cafe. We make sure that that stacks up so as we can also then afford to pay our shareholders. And then we also talked quite quickly yesterday about how did we then start affording kind of core costs and salaries. We wouldn't necessarily stack up all of our salary costs against each one of the buildings. We do get them to sort of float across the 4 buildings, and actually that's where we would look for grants to be able to subsidise those core costs. Because if we're dealing with buildings, you know, our first building was 25 years vacant, the Millennium's 15 years vacant, the Clipper was 3 years vacant, and the plot was 18 months vacant, then actually we're already having to do quite a lot of work to get them so they're functioning, so they can't be sustainable quickly. So our board looks with us all the time about that sustainability question. When should they start to break even? And when should they start to be stacking up? And what should the ratio between grant and trading be? And so we have that, and we kind of look at that each year as we go forwards. I don't know, Jess, whether you want to add in anything extra on that, or
just that I think that we're so similar in so many ways, but this is one of the key differences. This question about whether you share the risk in the bath across the whole
yeah.
set of portfolio, or whether you treat each building separately. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that at all. But each person, each group needs to think really carefully about that. Are you a bath or an ice cube tray organisation? I suppose we do separate it through this ecosystem. So all the risk is held by the social enterprise developer, which is 1/3 owned by the Community Land Trust, and the other 2/3 are owned by mission-driven entrepreneurs. One of them is myself, the Jericho Road, my company, and the other one is Meanwhile Space, community interest company. So we're mission-driven, but we're willing to take massive risk, much, much bigger risk than I would ever advise a community group to take in itself. So the Community Land Trust is not holding that risk. It owns 1/3 of the enterprise the social enterprise developer, but so if Ventures was to collapse, that would be an opportunity lost for the Community Land Trust, but it would never collapse the Community Land Trust. So there's different ways of mitigating the risk, is what I'm saying, I suppose. And the ice cube tray is one version with each building separated, and then there are other versions where you do it within the organisational structure.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jess. We also we were talking as well about how and when we got our local community involved to fulfil our ambitions to bring about change. And I think also this is where we have a difference. And I asked, well, what came out from our conversation yesterday is it's either quiet or it's noisy. And for Nudge, and I think really going back to that master plan example, but there's been so many different promises made in Stonehouse to our community. And we've been, you know, I've been volunteering for sort of 19 years. Hannah had been volunteering for 10 years before we started Nudge. And one of our core values, like I was saying, was not to overpromise. We didn't ever want to start you know, raising expectations and then not being able to deliver. So for us, it's really important for us that we build on, we're always listening, we're always in our community. You know, people, even when I go for a swim, they'll pop out of the water and start asking me and swimming with me at the side of me, asking me about things. And I really welcome that local accountability is great. So all of those conversations, they all go in, don't they, like a sponge for you, and then you start to really think about the change that can happen. But that doesn't mean that we keep that to ourselves. That once we've bought the building, then we'll be as noisy and we'll roar about it as we possibly can, and we will find lots of different ways to involve businesses, to involve our local community, individuals, volunteers, you know, kind of anyone that wants to have a stake in that building. We would really look because another value is about really recognizing the small and the connection, because it's that, isn't it? It's that genuine love for where you live and for other people in your neighborhood that also really starts to pay you back. And we used the L word in about 2014, and I think people thought we were swearing when we used the L word, but I think it's really powerful, because it is, like you were saying, Jess, about darning the fabric. It's about that patient drip, drip by drip, step by step, of not going away, and that belief that we can turn things around, rather than trying to juggernaut a huge plan through the middle of our neighborhoods. And so we are always, we're always quiet until we've got the building, and then we'll be really noisy. So Jess, do you want to have?
Yeah, I think that's great. I would love to do it like that. Sometimes you can't. Some of the buildings or assets, in order to acquire them at all, in order to have a chance of acquiring them, you have to make a big noise. So, and my first major experience of that was Hastings Pier. There was no way to acquire it quietly. We had to jump up and down. And the same with our power station site in Ore Valley, which is tragically not one of our successes. And that's the thing, it's if you have to do it noisily in order to acquire it, and then you fail, then you lose the battle, then that is really tragic. It has huge ripple effects on so many people who've been involved in that process. And in Ore Valley, we'd been on the site for 3 years, week after week, day after day, and people had fallen in love with the site, and they had come together and bonded around a big plan. But then we were evicted because the regeneration agency that owned it decided to flog it to a private developer. And we've always thought, what if we could have just pulled together a couple of £100,000 and gone and put it on the table and said, this land is worth zero, but here's the money, give us the deeds, really quietly right at the beginning. We didn't do that. I'm not sure whether that would have worked, but it certainly taught us a lesson that if you can do it quietly, then you should, and that if there are funders, we took quite a lot of money through Ore Valley from various funders, including Power to Change, and we ended up with a lot of benefits for the individuals, but no long-term legacy specifically on that site. If one of those funders had given us maybe a really shit-hot negotiator and 100 grand, we could have actually got the land, and then everything after that is so much easier. So when we bought Rock House, we did it quietly. Once you've got the building, you can, as you said, you can shout about it. You can make as much noise as you like, but try, if you can, to acquire without too much noise, is my learning. It's not my practice, but it's what I've learned.
I guess it is that happy accident for us that we were able to do that. But we did try to do the Palace Theatre on Union Street back in 2014. So when you talk about Ore Valley, I guess I can't say enough how resilient and amazing I think that you are in terms of some of the things that you've had to kind of process and work through over the years that you've been working in Hastings. But for us, we tried to do the Palace Theatre, and we almost got the keys. It literally, we were sitting down and he had them in his hand. And then the next day he signed a lease, which I think on paper meant the building was worth 2.5 million, because he had a lease for 25 years at 50 grand with somebody else. And so you have to just go, okay, all right. But it was so hard to see our community. We hadn't announced it, but people knew that we were trying. And then you have to step back, and we had to step back from that. We couldn't row in just for various different reasons on the charity that had been set up. And then it failed. And so that was really hard. And it wasn't necessary at that moment, but within a month we had spun round, and literally across the street there was Union Corner, a small shop, whereas the Palace Theatre is like a huge thing to save. And it would have taken all of our time, and we probably wouldn't have been able to do much else. And it wasn't going to be us leading it. We were kind of shepherding a whole sort of stakeholder group to help to do that. But we turned around, saw a small shop, knew that we could do a crowdfunder, raised 10,000, opened that up, took us 2 years, learnt lots about bureaucracy and red tape, and also 100-mile-an-hour winds where we had to put loads of concrete in the garden, almost like we were building the Shard. And then we opened that up and had a great time. So had we not have had that knockback of the Palace Theatre, and had we not have done Union Corner, we then wouldn't have gone, oh my goodness, actually we can see the real benefit here, let's buy the Clipper. We wouldn't have done that. And we nearly lost the Clipper because we were so taken by the Millennium, again a really big one. But it's brilliant that we did the Clipper and then we did the plot. And now, although it's so much bigger, the Millennium, actually we feel like we've learned so much going along and going forward. So those failures, they're never failures. It is that cliche of one door closing, another one opening, but also all that experience that you get and the experience then you take on to new projects. I just don't think it's ever lost. It'll come back out again. And Hannah and I always laugh about a jeweled ideas drawer, that we should jewel up a drawer and put all our ideas in, because actually we're probably still taking ideas out that we had maybe back in 2012 when we'd be in the pub laughing together about different things that we could do, because everything will have their day, won't they? And even if it doesn't work quite then it just wasn't the right time. And actually you still learn something by trying all of that and doing all of that. So our last segment really is to talk about solidarity and how important it is for both of our organisations. Jess, do you want to lead with that one?
Yeah, so sort of more generally about solidarity, I suppose it's about the kind of peer networking and mutual support that's been encouraged for a long time by locality, by Power to Change, and others. And it feels like this group, the CB Patchwork, has taken that a step further and become more peer-led, and that feels like a really good thing to me. During all that time, you mentioned some of the things that I've faced over the years, and during all that time, it's been solidarity and support across the sector that has kept me sane. Basically, it's been possible to continue because of knowing that there's all these people out there who are trying similar things and who care about what they're doing and about each other. The NIM, the Neighbourhood Investment Mechanism, that I've been working on recently to try to replace some of these horrendous numbers of funders, is a local thing, but it's potentially an investment approach that could share much more widely. That could be an umbrella or a solidarity neighbourhood investment mechanism of some kind that would sort of making mutuality go beyond the love. So the love is really important. The solidarity in the sense that we've got each other's backs is, I think, absolutely critically important. But taking it beyond that and making it really useful. So we hold assets across this movement in really ambitious community organisations, and maybe they can actually be leveraged together collectively to create more funding coming through, more investment coming through to projects that we are in a bit more control of through some kind of mutual approach, rather than being always in the funder-fundee or patron and beggar approach that too much of the funding is. And maybe one day we'll end up with a real estate investment trust that we own collectively across England or across the UK or even wider, where we are really using some private sector models to leverage assets, but doing that entirely for the benefit of local neighbourhoods.
I think it's incredibly exciting. I love that you're taking the lead on that work, Jess, and I know that you've been putting lots and lots and lots of thought in it. And I loved as well that you were talking on another call as well about insurance, that we all pay quite a lot of money for our insurance every year. Nudge, we haven't claimed on our insurance, but we've paid, how much have we paid? We've probably paid about £8,000 so far over the sort of 3 years, and we've just had quite a significant uplift because our turnover has gone higher. What if we were also putting our insurance in, and we could collectively, and I know there's a process that we'd need to go through setting something like that up, but actually it would be really great. And that's about having our backs, isn't it? About sharing that risk. And I do love that thought that if we could all put in some of our equity into a fund, it would be really quite amazing. Because I love, there was a photograph, I can't remember the artist, but it's a black and white photograph, and she has in her hands a red set of text to say who owns what. And if we are taking in quite a lot of public money to be able to redo these assets, obviously we want the change in our neighbourhoods, and we want our local communities to benefit. But actually, is there a way that we can also pass on that benefit nationally? I think it's really, really exciting. So for us, in terms of solidarity, we probably don't ask for enough help. I think we've got so many people that have our backs, and so many people that want to help, and sometimes we don't ask because we don't want to also be overwhelmed by too much advice as well, I guess, sometimes. But that has been crucial for us every step of the way, to be able to go and talk to other people, nationally as well as locally, to check things out, share the pain, share the joy as well, and really talk that through. And so we're currently, I think, because we always say that we've got a healthy dose of anger in us, of things that we want to change. And so really early on, it's that thing that I was talking about in terms of we saw the change that we'd started to make happen around Union Corner, and we saw the uplift that the landlord, because he had 4 or 5 properties around that little tiny thing that we did, he gained massively from longer, better tenants moving in, better businesses moving into those properties, so his income was more assured. And so that gave us then the thought that we go on to buy the Clipper. And then now, when we've been outbid by cash buyers, and we're starting to be approached all the time by people that want to do buildings on the street, it's made us really push through the idea of a land exchange. We want to set up an approach where we could try to use more powers, like compulsory purchase orders, as well as nudging some of those properties out into the street. But we'd want to find a way to mothball them quite quickly, so as you know, it wasn't dependent on another social enterprise or another social business getting themselves ready to go and get that building. We could act on that, get them in, maybe we do them up, and then maybe we really play around with sort of shared ownership, different leases, maybe selling them on at sub-market values. So we're doing all of that kind of tramping round in all of that at the moment, and we're being advised by some really talented national experts who get us to think quite a lot on every phone call about how that'll work. But we're getting a bit itchy, I think, at the moment, where we just kind of want to go and do something, because we also know that we learn a lot by doing, that we can talk and talk, and the more complex it becomes, the more that you might have to talk. Whereas actually, if we sort of say, okay, here's the first building that we're going to force through this process, then it gets everyone to be more practically minded, maybe, and to mobilize around sorting that out. So I love that you're doing the work on NIM, and you know, that's also kind of, it would complement some of the things that we're thinking about, and we would be really generous with sharing once we've set things up with the sector, about how, you know, what the pitfalls were, and how and what we did, and why we went about doing that. So we have overspoken a little bit, but I think we have 10 to 15 minutes now for questions. I will go and check in the chat, but do feel free to come off mute and pitch in with a comment or a question. Please do that now, but I will go through the chat as well while others might be talking. Thanks, Jess, as well.
Andy, do you want to talk about the scaling of Meanwhile that you mentioned in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Really enjoyed listening to you both, so thanks for sharing some of your insights. Yeah, I've the privilege of an interesting challenge at the moment, trying to scale up Meanwhile uses across Oxfordshire. So Make Space Oxford started in the city, but recently won a sizable contract from the government's Getting Building Fund to scale that approach, and to try and bring 50 buildings across the county, which are currently vacant, back into use. And they've set us the fun challenge of trying to do that in 12 months with £1.5 million, but that's all on capital, so we have to find a way to pay ourselves to do it. So we're about 3-4 months in, and we bid and wrote the tender prior to there being other variants and, you know, another lockdown on the horizon. the biggest challenge for us really is about how we try and do this, obviously, but also then how we try and do it in a sustainable way. This is wildly unsustainable growth. We're taking on leases of anything from a rolling month to hopefully 3 or 4 years, but it means cash flow is a real challenge. It means that we potentially end up privileging securing spaces for organisations which can pay, which are not necessarily the organisations that we feel are most important to reach out and support, who are perhaps worst impacted by COVID, etc. So we'd love to have some assets. We'd love to have secured something freehold that we can then leverage against. But Oxford is one of the most expensive places to live in Europe, as well as being one of the most unequal. And so just any insights you can share or thoughts about how to carry some of the learnings across into the very precarious meanwhile space, really, I suppose.
Wow. Would be my first comment. That's some challenge, actually, isn't it? 50 buildings all at once and not having the salaries to pay yourselves. I think that would be my very first thing to say, that we, for Nudge, we really did have to have the salaries to pay ourselves. We were giving up jobs, and you have to put food on the table at home. So I guess that would be my first bit of advice of seeing how you can fund that.
Should be clear. I mean, we are we've just expanded our team and we are paying salaries, and we have a couple of buildings against which we've already got an income. And we've taken out some loans, and some of the capital we can sort of fudge to put into paying for people's time to bring some of these buildings back into use, but it covers less, it covers about a third of it at best. So everyone is getting paid at the moment. We're not, we started as a volunteer outfit 5 years ago, but we're now kind of incorporated CIC. So yeah, but it's how do we ensure that they still have contracts at the end of the year is more the question.
Yeah, and that, that is a distracting thing as well, isn't it? While you're also doing the mammoth exercise. So yeah, I'd still approach funders to see whether you can get that 2/3 covered, because then that's one thing less to worry about, isn't it? And get it over a 3-year or longer period. Jess, I don't know whether you wanted to talk about any of the things that you've been learning from the NIM. I guess time is a bit of an issue for you. You've got 12 months to do this as well. Yeah,
till March next year.
There's something about being ready. So we got our first building because we'd taken a meanwhile lease on the basement in that building, never thinking that we would, literally never thinking anything about the rest of the building, just thinking we'll spend £200 a month on a meanwhile license. And then the agent phoned up and said, do you want to buy the whole building? Now obviously Hastings is cheap and Oxford is expensive, but if you've got 50 different buildings, there may well be one of those that does turn into that kind of opportunity. And I always think it's being in the right place at the right time with the right attitude, being open to these things. I could never have forced that agent. There was no way of forcing it. It was about being there and being seen as worth asking first before they put it to market. Yeah. And I think that, and then as well, following on what Wendy said as well, that if you could get a funder or a number of funders interested in the prospect of what you're doing and being able to put some amount of money into the wages, then what they would be investing in is that opportunity. So that the moment that opportunity does come, and we can't say whether it's going to come next week or at the very end of the process or maybe a year later, but when that opportunity comes, those funders will be fully aware of you and what you're doing and potentially ready to come in behind with some funds. Not all of Oxfordshire County must be that expensive. There must be some little scrappy bit that's got some, contamination or something wrong with it. That's the other thing, is that across our movement for the last 4 decades, the reason we have these assets in most neighbourhoods is because there was something wrong with them, that other people only saw what was wrong with them, whereas we, because we lived there, saw what was right with them and saw the opportunity. And that's true of everything from the Westway Development Trust, you know, underneath the A40, nobody wanted that space, through to Coin Street Community Builders. Amazingly, it seemed like hardly anybody wanted, you know, they bought it for £1 million, 13 acres of the South Bank, because nobody else saw it at that moment. So you have to look for the places that other people think are hard and horrid and trouble and buy them.
Yeah. And Andy, you might want to look, do you know Kindred as well? Erica Rushton's work.
First time I'd heard them was on this call, so yeah, I'll look them up.
So they look, I mean, maybe not with buildings, but they look to support on a large scale over a 12-month period and beyond, people setting up social enterprises in various different neighbourhoods. They'll go to a neighbourhood, basically they'll get funding from the local authority or from the greater local authority, and then they'll put calls out, and they have a whole process, and they're really interesting set of people to talk to. So definitely connect up with them and talk through their, or have a look at their website as well, crawl all over it.
That's
and
great.
Look at that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a shame Vidya dropped off, but you know, Power to Change won't touch this kind of thing with a barge pole, because it's, you know, it's 25-year lease minimum, and I think that's the general approach with funders who are maybe not necessarily funding an asset, but anything related to an asset. You've got 2-year lease.
It's worth a conversation though, because it's about the high street, you know, and everyone's been talking about the high street, and it's about making sure, isn't it, that actually they don't just all fall over, and there are uses, and you know, it doesn't suck out the energy from a city centre as well. I would guess your 50 buildings go across some of those areas that then you could start talking. So I still would sound them out. I would still start talking to funders around that, and kind of ignore the 2-3 years, because it is about, because you know, there's that lovely symbiotic relationship, isn't there, with just different properties. I'm realizing though that I think that we're going to get cut off from our breakout room. When we go back, we'll be asking for people to comment back. I guess Jess and I can lead some of that, but it would also be really nice to hear from you when we go back to the main room about what you've got out of the call today. I'm sorry I've not given people more air or looked too much at the questions. Apologies for that. I don't know whether people want to talk a little bit more while we just have I think it is less than about a minute, I think, before we go back. But if people would like to join in and say anything.
Could I jump in?
Of course. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, hi, Wendy. Yeah, you're doing great stuff. And Jess, I mean, well, we've talked about the NIM, of course. I mean, you know, I do think it's possible, but not conventionally. You know, I hate the word leverage, I'm afraid, Jess. We've had enough bloody leverage. Debt isn't the solution, but there are ways in which we can achieve this. And for me, it's about agreements. It's not about new organizations. Got enough organizations. But the way in which we can actually come up with agreements, frameworks, whether it's LLP frameworks to develop stuff, it's been around 20 years, you know, nigh on, completely achievable. And also frameworks, think of it like a development corporation, but this has really been what I've been working on the last 2 years, is the idea of unlimited companies, right? As basically, can you imagine, you know, Plymouth Unlimited, you know, as a framework, and literally bring together the different stakeholders. And it's all about meanwhile use as well, because you don't necessarily need to have dates involved. You know, you don't necessarily have to have a 10-year or a 5-year or anything. Meanwhile lease, you know, I was a member of a housing co-op in London for 10 years. I didn't have a freehold, I didn't have a tenancy, I didn't have a leasehold, I was a member. And for as long as I was a member, I could have the use. And that's the way to do it. Thanks.
Andy, connect up with Chris then, it sounds like. have a conversation outside of this about some of that.
We've already done that.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Great.
20 seconds.
Yeah, I think we'll be leaving, won't we? I think we'll get chucked out now. But thank you very much for attending. Really appreciate it.